Buonasera, benvenuti a GiovedìScienza.
Good evening to you all. Welcome to GiovedìScienza.
Grazie per essere qui. Salutiamo anche i nostri gonghisti di questa sera.
I would also like to welcome the youngsters who will be working on the gong. My name is Virginia. Good evening to you all. My name is Stefano. Hello. And let's try the gong.
Ma neanche
Not too delicately,
ma neanche troppo poca.
but not even too violently. I would like to remind you, and I tell our guests here, that you have the right to interrupt the conference once at any particular moment of your choice to ask them to repeat something that you haven't understood, and to obviously ask a question which has to do with the evening. So let's go on to the evening. Last week we spoke about beauty of animals with Christiane Nulleslein-Follar, who spoke about her research on zebrafish and on the genetic mechanisms that lead to those very beautiful stripes that they have in color, which are very important, extremely important in communication with members of the same species and which determine their relationship. We're going to be talking about genes again, and to a degree we're also going to talk about communication, relations, attraction among species which were different species. There were two species. One is ours, Homo sapiens, and the other one is Homo neanderthaliensis. Is that right? Yes, the Neanderthal man. And we will understand that there must have been some sort of exchange. We'll be talking about it with Serena Aneli, whom I would like you to welcome with a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Serena Aneli è una biologa.
Serena Aneli is a biologist. She is currently completing her doctoral studies, but she's also working for the Italian Institute for Genomic Medicine, and she is specializing in bio-IT applied to the genetics of populations, and she knows something about the Neanderthals, which she will be telling us in a very short time. Earlier on, we were saying we, Sapiens, we met the Neanderthals twice. Once, more or less 50,000 years ago, when we came from Africa, because we came from Africa, and they were here already. They were already in Europe. They'd been here for about 300,000 years, and this was their home, so to speak. Yes. Then we forgot them. Did they become extinct, or didn't they? Well, we certainly met them once again in 1856 in Germany, near Düsseldorf, in the Neanderthal Valley, hence the name Neanderthal, where a fragment of a skull and a few bones were found. Initially, it wasn't very clear. Sometimes, well, some people thought it were bears, but then we understood it was a new species that also determined the study of other types of Homo that preceded us. As far as the Neanderthal are concerned, and then I'll give her the floor because she knows much more than I know, I think that there are two myths that should be dispelled. The first is that they were brutes, as we considered them for a long time, cavemen, more primitive than us. The second myth that has to be dispelled is that they were so different from us, and it's not true, probably. With all probability it wasn't. And this is a recent discovery. Last 10, 20 years? Yes, archaeology of the past 10, 20 years. And Neanderthals look a lot like us, or we look like them, and if we look like each other, because at one point there was a relationship. I'm not saying any more. And I'm giving Serena the floor, and I wish you all a good conference, as always. Questions at the end.
Buonasera. Intanto vorrei cominciare ringraziando
Good evening to you all. First of all, I would like to start by thanking GiovedìScienza that it made it possible for me to be here and talk to you about what I study. And I would like to thank all of you who come here, and I would like to thank all those who in the course of these past 2 years worked with me, because without them it wouldn't have been possible for me to be here with you. I work at the Turin University, and I study human genetics, but there are many different branches of human genetics. Medical genetics that studies the molecular basis of some inherited diseases, and then there's forensic genetics, for example, paternity suits or other legal matters. But what I am involved in is molecular anthropology. That is the possibility to read within the sequence of our DNA the history of our ancestry. And this is what I would like to be talking about in the course of this presentation. That is to say, how is it possible to flip through the book of history using DNA? So what should we start with? From DNA. First of all, what is DNA? DNA is this. It's a sequence of 4 letters contained in each cell of our body, and you need 3 billion to make a human being. You are well aware of the structure. That is to say, it's the characteristic or well-known double helix. The 4 bases, the 4 letters G, C, A, T, are associated to form the 2 filaments or strands of the double helix. Where is the genetic information? It's in the order, in the sequence, which the 4 bases take in our DNA. So the sequence itself contains the genetic information which made it possible for our mothers to create an individual and make the individual live. Occasionally, however, there may be mistakes, especially in the phase of DNA replication. So where there should have been a T, say, there was a C or something like that. Now, if the repair mechanism fails to see this mistake, the mutation is then passed on to the next generation, our children. What does this mean? It means that we are full of these mutations, but these mutations do not make us mutants, but simply different. And this difference is something we realize about day in, day out, walking down the street, but we're not that different. If we take 2 people who are not relatives, say me and any one of you in this room, except for my parents, there's 0.1% difference. That is to say, a 1 mutation every 1,000 letters, while, say, between a person and a chimp, 1.2%, a mutation every 100 letters. We can then ask ourselves how many years are mutations. Well, what I mean is how old are our mutations. Some, for example, with my parents, others with my grandparents, or the people who lived in Europe 100,000 years ago, and others, for example, the shared ancestor between us and primates. And now we start to understand how DNA can be used to travel in time, because in DNA there are the traces of events that took place millions of years ago. Let us move on to part 2, that is to say, where I will explain how is it possible that in our DNA there's not just the genetic information which we need to work and operate and live, but there's also the history of our ancestors. First of all, we have to understand which ancestors we're talking about. Mine, yours, possibly the ancestors of a Native American or an African. Genetics tells us that over the long term, this question is not important, because if we go back in time enough, we share all our ancestry. For example, 2 generations ago, we had 4 ancestors, and they're our grandparents. 7 generations ago, we had 128 ancestors, and 33 generations ago, 8.5 billion. What doesn't work? Well, 33 generations ago, it's about 1,000 years ago, and there weren't 8.5 billion people. This means that at a certain point, some of us shared some of their ancestry, getting to the point where all of us, all of the people in this room, all the people on this planet shared all their ancestry. Here you see that every person is a mosaic of DNA fragments, different DNA fragments. Each part can tell a different story. So today we will be taking some of these fragments. We will be taking the ones which help us to tell a particular story as the story which then helps us answer the following question. Are there still Neanderthals around today? Many researchers have worked throughout the world for about 20 years to try and answer the question, and 20 years later they now have an answer, and the answer is it depends. Because it is true that they no longer exist. They were extinct 30,000 years ago, but some of you may have some DNA. But to understand how this was possible, you must take a step back and go back to the big journey. Our journey started in Africa around about 3 billion years ago with the appearance of the first Homo. Thereafter, several species appeared and disappeared, but all changed with the arrival of Erectus. In fact, Erectus was the first one to leave Africa and reached Asia. Fossils of Erectus have been found in Georgia, Spain, and even in the UK. Here in particular, around about 780,000 years ago, 5 people, adults and children, walked on mud, and we have their prints. Then in Africa, 700,000 years ago, another type, and it is the Homo heidelbergensis. Leaving Africa, some went to Asia, but some went to Europe, and some remained in Africa. This is the first fossil that was found. It's a jaw that was found near the Heidelberg, hence the name heidelbergensis. What did they look like? Well, their body was African-shaped. That is to say, they were quite tall, 1.80 meters, and thin. Why? Because the long bones, the limbs, were used to disperse heat. What happened thereafter? As from 500,000 years ago, the so-called Neanderthalization happened. That is to say, a process where hominids developed traits that were the hallmark of Neanderthals. For example, the skull elongated and they became shorter. Since I study genetics, I'm not so interested in what appears, what traits appear, but why certain traits appear and not others. So think about it. In Europe, it was very cold. It was the Ice Age, the Inter-Ice Ages, much colder than Africa. In a climate such as this, the shorter limbs developed because natural selection decided that in that way people would live better, could withhold heat more easily. But if some traits can be explained with natural selections, other, for example, such as an elongated skull, can not only be explained by the environment. They're not meaningful in that respect, but one possible explanation is the following. That is to say, the genetic drift. It's something whereby when a population reduces the number of individuals, genetic variability is also reduced. Some traits start having a very high frequency and others disappear, but in a rather random manner, and this might be an explanation for the appearance of some traits such as the elongated skull. What we do know is that 500,000 years, 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals appeared. It is a European history. Why? For 2 reasons. First is that only in Europe we have found pre-Neanderthal fossils. That is to say, these people who had the intermediate characteristics between the ones before and the Neanderthals. And then, because only Neanderthals, we found the large number of fossils. So what we do know is that Neanderthals arrived at the gates of Siberia and in the Middle East, but for 300,000 years they were the lords of Europe. So we can say that they were the real Europeans. Now we can ask ourselves another question. What did they look like? The first picture was rather cruel. This was the first fossil that had been found, 1856, in the Neander Valley, and the workers that found it thought that it was a bear. Well, it wasn't, but the biggest, most famous anatomopathologist thought it was a sick man. Several other fossils were necessary to have the portrait that we have today. What was the hallmark? Well, first of all, they were short, they were thick-set and muscly. They had an elongated skull and a protruding face, but the most distinguishing feature were the protruding eyebrows. They had no chin, because chins appear with the Sapiens, but they still had an African nose, which meant with flaring nostrils. So this didn't really work very well with the European climate, but they'd work something else. So that is to say, there were lots of little holes that are called foramina. They are for blood vessels, and therefore to have more blood going to the face. So they were certainly had red cheeks. But if we look at all these features, don't you think you've already seen them in someone? Well, if we saw a Neanderthal walk amongst us, maybe we would not be so surprised, because in the world there's 7 billion of us, and this is quite a large number that includes all the variability that the Neanderthals might have had. So basically, we've never seen a whole Neanderthal, but we've seen bits of Neanderthals here and there. And then the other big question is, how did they behave? Well, the first question that we have is clearly, did they speak? Did the Neanderthals speak? Were they speaking? Or was it a Homo salalus, non-speaking man? Well, we know that they could speak because they had the brain areas that are the Wernicke area to understand words, and the Broca area, which is the production of sound. And they also had a hyoid bone, which is a bone which is here at the basis of our tongue, and which is used to articulate words. So what do we know? We know that they could speak. We don't know whether they did, but they could. According to archaeologists, a proof of it is that they did is in the type of stone industry. That is the way in which they produced their tools. In practice, for about 200,000 years, they used the same way to produce a tool. That is to say, here you see the Levallois type of stonework. It's a very difficult one to replicate, so it appears to be impossible that for 200,000 years they used the same way to produce stone tools without instructing the youngsters through speech. Another feature which proves their humanity, in inverted commas, is the fact that they liked beauty. That is to say, some objects that were beautiful but absolutely useless. Look at this. It's called Excalibur, and it was used by the early Neanderthals 130,000 years ago. Now, this is a very important tool. It was like the Swiss Army knife for the Neanderthals, but this one was never used. It was made, built, and then it was thrown away. Probably it was to do with a funeral ceremony, and then ornaments. And I was really surprised. This is a necklace, which is made with the claws of an eagle. And here you can see that there are the little holes, but these are the the last two features I've listed are the most important ones. That is to say, burying their dead, and that was in particular in the last period, and also looking after their weaker ones. So here you see in Shanidar in Iraq, a person's bones were found in a cave, deaf, half-blind, didn't have lacked an arm, and in spite of that, he lived to 40, and 40 was a great old age in those times. So clearly, he had managed to survive thanks to the help of others. And now that we've freed ourselves of all the prejudice that we had on this different human form, we can continue with the story. So what happened at the Heidelbergensis in Asia and Africa? In Asia, we have the Denisova, another human form, while in Africa, we have our Sapiens ancestors. This leads us to another comment. That is the fact that currently we are the only ones. There are no other human forms that are a bit different from ours. Instead, only 70,000 years ago, the world was populated by several human forms that were possibly a bit different from us, but that walked standing up and shared a lot of our skills. While currently, if we have to think of the closest form to us, we have to think of the large primates, chimps, bonobo, and gorilla, but none of them shares our social skills. What we do know is that 100,000 years ago, some of the sapiens decided to leave Africa and started that journey of colonization of all the lands which took them within 100,000 years onto the moon. The question is, in this journey of colonization of the world, did the Neanderthal and the sapiens meet? Well, certainly they did. We know this through archaeology, because, as we said, that for 200,000 years, the Neanderthals used the same technique, the two cut their tools, but when the sapiens arrived, they changed, and they used the technology that the sapiens had. And for many archaeologists, this is proof of a meeting, not of love. And again, archaeologists are trying to give a few answers with this fossil. This is OAS1, a person found in Romania, 40,000 years old. And for many archaeologists, this person is a hybrid between Neanderthal and Sapiens. Has the skull of the Sapiens, but a wide face of the Neanderthal. For some people think it's a hybrid, but this was not a final answer, because the physical features may enter a population not necessarily because of an outside genetic meeting, but because of an adaptation to the environment. If we can't answer this in our past with the science or through the science, like archaeology, paleontology, so, well, where can we find the answers? Well, we find them in the DNA, or in DNA. We find ancient DNA and there were some scientists who learned how to read it. This was one of the biggest revolutions of molecular biology in recent times. That is to say, the possibility of extracting and analyzing DNA from fossils. So we started with 1984 with the quagga. The quagga was supposed to be an extinct horse, then a mammoth and a bear, and lastly Neanderthal. So as you can imagine, it's not that easy. In fact, ancient DNA is fragmented and chemically modified and contaminated. What is it contaminated by? By the DNA of fungi and bacteria that were in the ground, but also by the DNA of the people who are working on these bones, archaeologists and molecular biologists. So the Svante Pääbo group managed to develop a protocol which was very rigorous to overcome all these problems. And this meant that in 1997 they obtained the mitochondrial DNA of a Neanderthal, starting from the first fossil, that is to say, the one found in the Neander Valley. Beware, I said mitochondrial DNA. Well, we just spoke earlier on about nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA is the one which is found in the nucleus of each of our cells. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, is in mitochondria. Mitochondria are small organelles in each one of our cells used to produce energy. But why didn't Pavo extract nuclear DNA and started extracting mitochondrial DNA? Well, because it was much easier. In fact, if each one of our cells has only one copy of nuclear DNA, every cell has many copies of mitochondria, and every mitochondria has lots of copies of mitochondrial DNA. So it is more probable that it has survived. In any case, the Pavo group analyzed the sequence of DNA, which is this one, compared it with the DNA of people who are living, people like us, and what did he see? He saw that it was very different. That is to say, it was very different from ours. So what did he conclude? He concluded that Neanderthals reached extinction without contributing to the mitochondrial DNA of Sapiens. But what was the problem? The problem was that mitochondrial DNA is very small. There are 16,000 bases compared to the 3 billion ones in the nuclear DNA. And also it only tells us half of the story. Mitochondrial DNA is only inherited by women. And if in a female line a woman has only one male son, her mitochondrial DNA is lost. So it is possible that we haven't got any Neanderthal mitochondrial simply by chance. So what happened? We had to move on to nuclear DNA, and this is a beautiful interview by Pavo, who said that in the 1990s many journalists said that he would never be able to analyze the nuclear DNA, and he said that it is much better to never predict science, especially negatively, to say you will never manage, because the only limit of science is technology. In the years 2000s, there were machines that made it possible to sequence DNA, that is to say, to read and transcribe the 3 billion bases that make up DNA. So at this point, he had the technology to analyze the DNA, technology to read it. He only needed a fossil. He found this here in the Vindia cave in Croatia. This is the image that a Neanderthal 50,000 years ago would have seen looking from his or her front door, apart from the bicycle. Inside this cave, archaeologists found 3 bones of 3 different Neanderthals from 50,000 years ago. They extracted it, they sequenced it, and they obtained 55% of Neanderthal genome. It's not a very big percentage, but it was enough to start answering some of the questions. The first question was, did they cross? Did they mate? Well, if they had mated in Europe, this means that modern Europeans should share more mutations with the Neanderthals compared to Africans, because Neanderthals were never in Africa. So a group of Harvard developed this test. This test, which is called the 4 populations, where basically they went to see for each mutation in 4 different genomes how many times Europeans and Neanderthals share the same mutation and how many times African and Neanderthals shared the same mutation. When they compared a French person, an African, and Neanderthal, they saw that the French were much closer to the Neanderthal. They saw the same thing when they used the Chinese, which was strange because they didn't think that Neanderthals had gone that far east, but see the same thing when they used someone from Papua New Guinea, and then they had never been there. What does this mean? It means that it doesn't matter where we come from, but all the people outside Africa have Neanderthal DNA. Now we can continue the story. Sapiens left Africa, met the Neanderthals, love story, and they had children. We are the children. Probably This happened in the Middle East. The population that was formed, that emerged, was the population that then colonized the whole of Eurasia and reached right up to Papua New Guinea. This is the reason why the populations of Papua New Guinea, where the Neanderthals never arrived, have Neanderthal DNA. And then in the Pavo group, two more presents came from the Denisova cave on the Altai Mountains in Siberia. That is to say, a toe and the phalanx from a hand. Let's start with this one here. Archaeologists were so good that they recognized that this was in fact the phalanx of a hand, of a human hand. And luckily that they did this, because this is the one that helped us make a big discovery. The DNA of this bone belongs to a species that had never been seen before. That is to say, a species that is called Denisova, because the cave was called Denisova. This species, according to DNA, is a sister species of Neanderthals. In the past, it contributed to the DNA of Melanesians. Of this people, we've never found fossils apart from the two molars that you can see, so we don't know what they look like. And it is fascinating that for the first time we are faced with a genome, a DNA, looking for a fossil and not vice versa. The second present is this, that is to say, it's a bone from a toe of a woman Neanderthal who lived 40,000 years ago. The DNA contained in this bone was of such good quality that they managed to extract 99.9% of the Neanderthal genome. With this percentage, it was possible to answer a number of questions. The first question is, how much DNA, Neanderthal DNA, have we got? Analyzing that sequence, we see that between 1% and 3% of all the populations that are not African inherited Neanderthal DNA. This was an incredible discovery, because along with the archaeological discoveries on culture and the aspect of Neanderthals, it contributed to change the way in which we saw them. From brutes and animals as we saw them, they became, at least our direct ancestors. So much so that in part of our genome, we're more Neanderthal than Sapiens. The other question is when. That is to say, when did the meeting between Sapiens and Neanderthal take place? So to answer this question, we're going to study recombination. Recombination is a genetic phenomenon whereby the fragments of DNA that we inherit from our ancestors become shorter as we move from one generation to the other. Here you see the dark DNA is Neanderthal, and clearly Neanderthal has the entire, say, chromosome 12. What happens to somebody who lived 200 years after the admixture? Part of his DNA or her DNA is still Neanderthal, but there are white bits that are Sapiens. Why? Because part of the ancestry is Sapiens. 8,000 after the admixture, there are still Neanderthal parts, but they're smaller, while in somebody from our day and age, they're even smaller. So by piecing together the length of this region with the time that has elapsed, it was possible to calculate a sort of anniversary. That is to say, the meeting happened between 54,000 to 49,000 years ago. The next question is, where did they meet? Well, we know that certainly they met in the Middle East. This is what we were saying earlier on. But they also met in Europe. Yes. And always one tells us, do you remember that person, the Romanian, that had the intermediate feature between Neanderthal and Sapiens? They analyzed his DNA and discovered that between 6 and 8% of his DNA was Neanderthal. And looking at the length of the region, they saw that there were only 4 to 6 generations previously, one of his ancestors had been a Neanderthal. So it happened in Europe. Question, where is the DNA? That is to say, Is it in all our chromosomes, or are there regions that have more Neanderthal DNA than others? A Harvard group started studying our genome and saw that there are regions where we're not Neanderthal, and they are mitochondrial DNA, but we saw that before, Y chromosome, X chromosome, and the genes expressed in testicles. That is to say, the ones which are important for testicles. What does this mean? All these are regions which in one way or the other have to do with reproduction. Now, it might be possible that the hybrid Sapiens Neanderthal was less fertile, and therefore natural selection eliminated the Neanderthal parts from all those regions, all those chromosomes that they thought were important. And this is the reason why some of our chromosomes, in particular our sexual chromosome, do not have Neanderthal. Then the next question.
Buonasera, ora si sente. Noi siamo due studenti di biologia dell'università.
We are studying biology and Vercelli, and personally I have a question. During one of the lessons, the professor spoke about a mitochondrial Eva and a Y chromosome Adam, but now you said that probably the Neanderthal chromosome is not in the mitochondria. So I would like to ask you, how can we talk about one mitochondrial Eve? And I would like to add, if possible, who is this mitochondrial Eva or Eve?
Beh, sono domande toste queste comunque.
Well,
allora,
these are complicated questions. The analysis of mitochondrial DNA revealed that we have a common ancestor from a mitochondrial point of view in Africa about 200,000 years ago. What does this mean? This is a sapiens, so it's a mitochondrial Eve, because the mitochondrial DNA is only transmitted through women. What your professor said is correct. That is to say, there is an Eve who lived in Africa so many years ago, but is sapiens, while this one is Neanderthal. And in our mitochondrial DNA, there is no Neanderthal DNA. So the theory remains also for the Y chromosome, because they don't have any Neanderthal DNA. So this too is correct. One might try to look for a mitochondrial Eve, not a sapiens, but Homo pre-sapiens, maybe talking about 6 million years ago, something or a being that is shared by us and primates. Right. The next question was, what is the use of DNA? This is very linked to the previous question, that is to say, where is Neanderthal DNA? Because if we have areas of Neanderthal DNA, it's because at one point they had some use, or they still do have a use. If we don't have anything else, it's because possibly they were useless, or even they might have harmed us. In the course of time, several experts and scientists have tried to identify the role of our DNA, the Neanderthal DNA. The most interesting one is color: skin, eyes, and hair. And we're talking about the color of skin. Skin, as you know, is a very complex part. That is to say, there's not one gene that determines the color of our skin, but there are very many. But there is one that has a Neanderthal mutation that is associated to light skin and is also associated to a greater ability to synthesize vitamin D. Now, we sapiens, when we arrived from Africa, we were black, because in Africa it is more advantageous to have black skin because it protects you from the sun, while in Europe, the Neanderthal, who had been here for 300,000 years, had a light skin, because light skin made it possible to better absorb the sun rays and synthesize vitamin D, which is necessary for our bones. So when sapiens arrived in Europe, this specific mutation was one of the first that they acquired, because it was very advantageous in the new environment. Another advantageous mutation is the one that we can metabolize fats to have a Neanderthal diet that was richer in meat, and then the ability to defend ourselves from LDL, that is the bad cholesterol. But this is the most important, that is to say, a completely new immune heritage that make it possible for us to defend ourselves from the new viruses and bacteria that we had never met in Africa. But they also left us some things that we would have avoided quite happily. For example, mutations that mean that we coagulate our blood more rapidly. This means that in this day and age, it's probably to do with heart pathologies and strokes and heart attacks, and also diabetes type 2, and also mutations that give us a higher risk of becoming addicted to cigarettes. Well, Neanderthals did not smoke, and tobacco was introduced to Europe 400 years ago. In this landscape, which I've just described, we have the study that we carried out at the Turin University in cooperation with the Oxford and Pavia universities. It is a study, the aim of which is to create a genetic map of Italy, that is to say, to study the genetic variability of the populations in Italy and to retrace the events that determined it. Why Italy? Well, first of all, because we live here, but also because Italy is at the center of the Mediterranean and for a long time was the crossroads of many different populations, and they all left a trace in our DNA. So what did we do? We gathered the DNA of 1,600 Italians, plus a series of people from all over the world. We used literature, that is to say, other different papers, 60 people, the information on 60 people who lived in Europe many thousand years ago. And then we went to the Siberian Neanderthal, which I spoke to you about. So in this last part of my presentation, we considered archaic genetic variability from the Neanderthals. We asked the question, who's the most Neanderthal in Europe? Well, because we know that each and every one of us has a DNA Neanderthal, but we're asking ourselves whether someone has a bit more. So, to solve this riddle, we compared the DNA of the Neanderthal to 1,000 people, 500 of whom were Italian. So the darker dots indicate a larger amount of Neanderthal, while the lighter ones a smaller quantity. We saw that the amount of Neanderthal DNA decreases if we go towards the south, and this can also be seen if you look at Italy. So we can say that the northern population have more Neanderthal DNA than the ones in the south, both in Europe and Italy. So what's the advantage? Why are we so different? We saw that some of these regions, as we saw before, had genes where we were protected by kidney problems or eyes and hair and skin, a new immune system, or metabolizing fats. And for some of these, in some of these regions, we're very different. There's an enormous variability between or among European populations and Italians. The same variability is also present for the negative aspects. So, for example, hypertension, Parkinson, Alzheimer's, depression, and tobacco addiction, and metabolic disorders, for example, diabetes. Again, for these mutations, we vary a lot. What does this mean? It means that the Neanderthal inheritance is a bit like the inheritance that an old aunt might have left us. What does it mean? Maybe some jewels, maybe a few nice clothes, but also debts. Now, the problem is that not that Neanderthals didn't do it deliberately. What we see is that on the one hand, we have regions that gave us advantages in terms of the evolution, but on the other, we see that there are regions of the DNA that in fact hinder us, and this happens because of genetic and social reasons. For example, the light skin gene, the same one, is associated to cancer, skin cancer, and burns. What does it mean? Does it mean that they didn't have skin cancer? Well, maybe they did, but they certainly didn't want to have a suntan like we do. Or, for example, rapid blood coagulation. For a Neanderthal and a Sapiens of 50,000 years ago, it was a big advantage to coagulate blood much faster, because it meant that any wounds would heal much faster, fewer infections. But now with our modern society, this means that you have clots in your arteries, and that's a risk. Or, for example, accumulation of fat. Again, for people who were existed 50,000 years ago, it was a big advantage, because it meant that you could survive periods when you didn't have enough food. But now, when you have 5 meals a day, this means you can be obese. There are some features which we can't find an advantage. For example, neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. Why do we get it? Why were they not eliminated through selection? Well, because Neanderthals didn't have it, because certainly they didn't reach 70 or 80, which is when these diseases developed. And then, in fact, these are diseases that are not under control of selection. Why? Because the onset of these diseases after the reproductive age. Selection is unfortunately very cynical, is not so interested in the well-being of the individual, but the life of a population. So if a disease develops after the person has had children and therefore has increased the population, natural selection doesn't see, so to speak, their genes as much. Now we have a complete picture to answer the question, are there still any Neanderthals today? Well, we said that they were the dominators of Europe for 300,000 years, but 30,000 years ago they disappeared into nowhere. In fact, the extinction of the Neanderthal in time is as important as the disappearance of red squirrels. Why have red squirrels disappeared in the UK? Because we've had grey squirrels, which is a more dynamic species and which competes for resources. And this is a fundamental ecological law. That is to say, when their habitat disappears, they disappear. This may have happened when the Sapiens arrived. When a small population of a slow social life, think of the Neanderthals for 300,000 years, used the same technology to build their stone tools, suddenly is faced by a more numerous population or with a more rapid social life when they arrived in Europe. In 20,000 years, they changed about 10 different techniques for stone tools. So the former disappears, and this very often means the death of its members unless they mix, and so we have a sum of the two. And this is what happened. That is to say, both genetics and archaeology indicate this. That is to say, genetics for what I have said. That is to say, the fact that we have Neanderthal DNA after they mixed, and archaeology with the fact that Neanderthals of the last period learned from the Sapiens. At this point, we're changing the way in which we think about it. Maybe it wasn't mass extermination by the Sapiens, of the Neanderthals, but maybe it was assimilation, a blending of the two cultures, that is to say, an extinction through hybridization. And it is only thanks to this assimilation that took place that Neanderthals were able to survive, no longer as a creature, as a free creature roaming the earth, but inside our DNA. So the last thing I'd like to say is this, that is to say, while the Sapiens was developing, migrating, and evolving, the same thing was other types of human beings, the Denisova in Asia, the Neanderthal in Europe, and other archaic forms in Africa. Other forms which we don't know the existence of. So just as now we have seen that there is a question. You thought that you had escaped the second question. Yes, I didn't. No. I would like to ask, is it true that there is another type of Homo genus that lives in the Philippines that has not completely disappeared? It's more difficult to answer these questions. I think that you're talking about the Floresiensis. The story of Floresiensis is a very amusing story because it's generally nicknamed a hobbit, a very, very small being. Probably was not extinct. Well, the same thing probably happened. That is to say that the DNA of the Florensis is present in other people. Well, they are extinct. What some researchers have done is to analyze the DNA of this being. I think there was a paper published last year and they compared it to modern DNA. I honestly can't remember whether they contributed or not. I think not, but I'm really not sure. But yes, talking about human forms, there was also the Floresiensis. I can't remember where they are in the timeline. I say 70,000 years ago they exist. I can't remember the Floresiensis where it was, but might be there. In any case, Floresiensis is one of the others. There might be many others that we don't know the existence of. In Africa, for instance, why have we not found them in Africa? Well, because simply it's too hot and the DNA doesn't keep. You either need a dry environment or very cold. But who knows? Who knows what we might discover? So what I would like to say is that maybe the linear development of evolution is not so correct. Maybe we don't go from a more primitive species to a more complete species using a straight line. Maybe evolution is like a tree. There are branches. Every branch is a human form. These meet, they separate, some die. New forms develop. But what is true is what we saw. That is to say that we are not exclusively sapiens, we're also something else. And it is so only by studying this and to find various traces in the DNA that we can answer the basic question. That is to say, who are we? I've finished my presentation here. I would like to thank the group I've been working with in Turin, the Oxford group and the Pavia group that were essential, and all of you for having been here and for having followed me with great attention. Thank you very much.
E noi ringraziamo Serena Aneli.
We'd like to thank Serena, and I invite you to ask all the questions you'd like to. Would you like to stay there or come back here? She's going to stay there. She doesn't want to sit next to me, right? I understand. Well, I'm going to say something which I didn't say at the beginning. Serena Aneli is the person who won the 2018 GiovedìScienza Prize.
È un applauso valido, perché è sempre valido, ma tardivo, perché appunto
It's a worthy applause, but belated because 2018 was last year's edition. The GiovedìScienza Prize is a prize that that is awarded to under 35s and In particular, researchers who have both good result and because they're able to popularize it and their skill. And you have seen an example of it. The prize is a prize in money, but also in taking part in the next season of GiovedìScienza. And here she is. I would also like to take advantage in the fact that the next edition will soon be held. So young researchers join us. Maybe there's someone here. You're invited to take part. Are there any questions? Yes. My question.
L'uomo si è spostato dall'Africa verso l'Asia, verso l'Europa.
Humans went from Africa to Asia to Europe and mixed. What about the Americas? Because life was there too. I'm curious to know what happened there. Well, the Americas came much later. All the studies say that we started in Africa, and from Africa we started moving. But all studies that involve other human forms, apart from Sapiens, concentrate on Africa and Europe, because at that point there were no humans in the Americas. So there are very many studies, especially American groups that are interested in this, like we studied Italy, they want to study the States, that are working in this direction, and they're discovering things which are rather contrasting on the date of when humans reached it, but they were no archaic forms. We then reached it later. Another question?
Io ero invece curiosa di sapere qualcosa in più sulla ricerca.
I was curious to know more about research, the research that you carried out. You said that there were about 1,600 Italians. How did you select them? What type of representativity over 60 million, which is the Italian population? Most of these research projects that are called population genetic research projects, where you want to understand the difference, is to take people who have all 4 grandparents from the same region. Why? Because if my 4 grandparents came from the same region, very probably their DNA comes from that region. So I needed to have a very representative sample of a part of Italy. And this is what we did. This was done over years, and in our work we only put together the efforts that others, people, we're talking about research carriers started 20 years ago. The regions, well, we had, with the 1,600, we managed to cover most of, or if not all of the regions of our peninsula. But what is important is the fact that they had to have 4 grandparents in the same region. So I would know good because my father comes from Sicily and my mother's from Piedmont. So maybe genetically I would possibly resemble someone from central Italy. I don't know if I answered your question.
C'è una replica.
Sì, no, questo l'ho capito.
Yes.
Però, tenendo conto anche della storia,
I understand this, but also considering recent history, Italian recent history, no Italian. Italian grandparents of 4 grandparents might have come from wherever, because Italian history is a crossroad of history and mixture known in the past 1,000 years. The Germans, Normans, the Swabians. Yes, this is sure, but this was the safest bet that we had. That is to say, to have that limited, but subsequent analysis suggests suggested also that we should analyze the DNA and form clusters, that is to say, genetically similar groups, where we had surprises. For example, people who said that they were from a certain region ended up clustered with other regions. So subsequent studies is something that we did using these groups that are very similar, where really we might say that that was the northern macro area or macro area north or south. So the bioinformatic techniques where you analyze the DNA and to see where we're similar and to piece all that together is something which saves us from the great mess that took place on our peninsula. There's another question.
Buonasera, intanto la ringrazio per la sua bella conferenza.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your beautiful conference. Pity it's finished. And you concluded it with a question, which is essential. Who are we? So I ask myself now, all your conference showed us the various species right up to this day and age, all of this. How is it linked to humans created by God? Oh, well. Oh, dear me. I thought that theirs was a difficult question. This is quite another kettle of fish. I'll try. It's a question. It's a legitimate question. I remember when I used to go to my parish, we had a discussion of this kind. It was about 10 years ago. There was a dear friend of mine. I was 15 maybe. Well, there was a friend of mine who was he was older than me, and he was at university and he was studying biology. And he asked him the same question. The image which I showed you, that is to say, of the line of our evolution, which is not so linear, but is more similar, or looks like the branches of the tree. And so there was a chaos went on, and different opinions, different ideas. And then the priest came along and said something that I believe in. He said, "Do you believe or not?" We were at the parish, so we said, "Yes, of course, otherwise we wouldn't have been here in church." Yes. Well, then he said, "Then that's fine." All the part which you tell, which is narrated in the Bible, creation, Moses, children, and so on, was written because it was culturally suited to the people of the time. We have a different approach nowadays. We don't need to believe in genealogy. We can believe in a simple idea, an idea of creation. Maybe the beginning of creation was the primeval broth. Doesn't necessarily have to be the first human being on Earth. I don't know if this has answered the question.
Era difficile come domanda.
It was a difficult question. It was a difficult question. I don't know if your answer is that of a believer, but it's not important to know that. Please. Thank you very much. I too thank you very much, because it was, as far as I'm concerned, very clear presentation. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to ask a question
dove ci fosse bisogno,
so that you might shed light on the notion of race. If I understood correctly, as far as you explained, that to talk about race amongst humans is wrong. and ridiculous. Maybe the Neanderthals or the other races you spoke about that have been extinguished, and I don't know if extinct is correct, and if you can apply race in that case too. But the question, since it's a question I'd like to ask you, is the following. Have you formulated a hypothesis of where and in what direction our evolution is going towards? Thank you. Well, I'd start with the last one, that is to say, where are we going to, with a bit of a provocation. If we go on like this, it'll be the destruction of our planet and our extinction. I don't know how long this will take us. I'm not an expert, but this is our fate. The previous question on the notion of race is very important now, especially given the most recent statement by Watson. He's the one who had discovered the double helix, a brilliant scientist who made this discovery in the 1950s. And recently he said not only that there are races, because to say that there are races per se doesn't make you racist. Where's the racism? The racism when you say that one is better than the other. Now, with the Neanderthal, you can't even talk about race. You talk about species. The biological meaning of species, two species are different. When they hybridize, their offspring are not fertile, but we can't talk about that because we know that we have both. Can we talk about race with someone who has a different color skin? Well, no. Another thing I'd like to say is on the use of the word. We can call them whatever we wish. Clearly, there are differences. The first, the most obvious one, is the color of skin. There are. It's unquestionable. We can call them races, we can call them ethnic groups, we can call them populations. But it is true that words are words, in the end, whatever you want to call them. But given that words are words, we could also not call them race. Why? Because especially in Europe, the word race, but also in the US, and they weren't particularly better off than us, the word had a very important meaning with millions of deaths, while in the US, connecting ourselves to what Watson was saying, the white race being above, or race, for thousands of years, there were people who were not considered. When in the 1950s, Watson, I think he was awarded 50s or 60s, there were still buses for whites and for blacks, and now he's given these statements. Now the scientific committee, or the scientific community I should say, is a bit embarrassed because in any case he's a Nobel Prize. He's not the, he's 90. Yes, but Piero Angela too is 90. Yes, Piero Angela's 92, but I think that rather than age is his character. Watson, not according to me, I've never met Watson, but according to those who worked with him, was a very good scientist, but he was a very bad human being. He was and is, because he's still alive. He's a bit arrogant. So when you get to 90, 78, 90, you don't work anymore. You disappear from the scene, the working scene, and from the scientific world, from research. In this case, he felt that he'd been sidelined, and he thought that the best way to say something idiotic, because they have a greater impact. This is how I would explain it, rather than truth or not truth, because from a scientific point of view, there are no races. There are differences, but differences are not big enough to give discrete differences. What do I mean by this? If the question, are there races, first you have to define what a race is. What is a race? If you answer that question, then the next question, there are races. But I still haven't found a definition of race, just as there is a definition of species.
Ne approfitto per ricordarvi che il
would like to remind you that on the 14th of February, we will have Guido Barbuiani, and I'm sure he'll be touching many of these topics. So I invite you to come. Obviously, come to the other conferences too. Any other questions?
Io intanto volevo chiedere una cosa.
In the meanwhile, I would like to ask a question myself. Genes tell us lots of things, as the conference showed, but also archaeologists are still of some use, apparently. This is an area of study where various disciplines emerge. The biographies of the scientists, too, you were told Svante Paavo, and here I suggest that you read the story of this, the Neanderthal man Einaudi, and he started off as a historian and Egyptologist, then he became a doctor. He did a PhD in medicine, and then he specialized in molecular biology. And Serena, too, has a curriculum which is quite mixed.
Allora, queste scienze ovviamente non viaggiano.
These sciences, this area, don't work on its own because the world is so complex that one science is not enough to understand complexity. Think of what we were saying earlier on. It wasn't Svante Paavo who was certainly digging. There were archaeologists doing that. Archaeologists worked with him on the best methodologies not to contaminate findings. While Svante Paavo asked them where they found them, and all the articles that have been published over the past few years are written by many authors and that come from many walks of life. Again, blending. Maybe that's the answer. Thank you.
Buonasera.
Question?
Io volevo chiedere come sono state ricostruite le
I'd like to ask
abitudini
how you rediscovered how the Neanderthal civilization worked, for example, burial, etc. Well, it's a bit difficult for me to answer because this is not my area, but I've read a book that I suggest you read, My Dear Neanderthal, that speaks about archaeology and anthropology. In fact, all the things that I told you in this respect come from there. As far as burials are concerned, it's important to say that if they hadn't buried their dead, we wouldn't have had the DNA, because a body left out in the middle of the forest clearly would decompose more rapidly. In 50,000 years, there would be nothing left. We wouldn't have even had the bones. So that in itself is deductive proof. The second thing, that in particular in the last part of their lives, 50,000 years ago, they found, mainly in caves, points where you could see that it was a burial because of the position of the body. This is what is written in the book. The important thing is that the burial of the dead didn't come with Sapiens. They started burying their dead 50,000 years ago, long before the Sapiens arrived, 10,000 years before the Sapiens arrived. This is why I said it is a human feature. As far as ornaments are concerned, there are very many examples. There's a necklace. There is this tool which had never been used because it hadn't been chipped. They could see the difference. So they'd ask themselves question, maybe it was a funerary offering. The necklace, you don't even have to say it. It's clearly an ornament. And then again in the book they say they killed animals, in particular birds, that couldn't be eaten, that weren't edible, because they wanted the feathers, maybe to use them as ornaments. This is all a part of the research that archaeologists and anthropologists did. Another thing is that a part of the discoveries, the anthropological discoveries of this different human form comes from the observation of modern hunter-gatherers, maybe Inuits or other populations, aboriginals. There are anthropologists who look at their way they behave and then piece the bits together, and they notice that there are similarities. For instance, in the book it says that the authors believe that Neanderthal groups, clans in which they lived, were not, did not have more than 30 people. And I said, why 30? Why not 40? I don't know. And in the section further on, it says that 30 people is the maximum number of people where a group of hunter-gatherers can live well, can find what they need and get the group to survive. 40 too many. And so they thought that maybe Neanderthals too lived in groups of 30. Since it was mentioned, the other book that is suggested is by Sylvana Condemi, a French scientist, and François Sabatier, who's a French scientific journalist of French descent. My dear Neanderthal Lati Boringhieri, you'll find everything on the leaflet which is distributed. Please, at the entrance. There were still a few questions. I think we can have 2 questions.
Volevo chiedere, è vero che anche Sapiens
I would like to say that Sapiens too nearly became extinct, that they only had a very small group that then evolved. I don't know this. I don't know it. That we have this mitochondrial Eve is due to the fact that the mitochondrial DNA was from a very small population. Probably at the beginning. At the beginning of our history, we're talking about 200, 300,000 years ago. Our population was very, very small. But as time went by, it developed, it colonized the whole world. A first exit from Africa was 100,000 years ago, then second 50,000 years ago. These were very small groups, so yes, it is possible that one of these groups could run the risk of becoming extinct. There is a lot of research that spoke about some populations of which currently we have the DNA of some individuals, but when they compare it with our DNA of modern people, they see that it has nothing to do with it. What does this mean? That those people, it means that those people did not have any children, or their DNA, that particular group or group of people became extinct. So many human groups in the course of evolution risked the extinction, precisely because the risk was that they should spread in an enormous area from Africa, so reasonably they had to live in small groups. Well, 2 more questions. Good evening. This is my question. How is it possible that a group of primitive individuals like Sapiens and Neanderthals developed in the Americas when it was not possible to cross the oceans, or were it primates that evolved directly? No. The Sapiens arrived much later. I'm not going to give you a date because I can't remember it, and partly because it is constantly debated. At one point, there's always a new researcher that says that he or she has found a Sapiens who is 1,000 years previous to the date given. Around about 10,000 years ago. At that point, there were no Neanderthals. The only human form was the Sapiens. And the colonization of the Americas probably happened through the Bering Strait during a mini glaciation, in the same way in which, for instance, the erectus or other forms arrived in the UK during glaciation. The sea was no longer there. It was covered by ice, and so they could cross. This is the way. What you were talking about, possibly, is the multi-regionalism, that is to say, the hypothesis, which is quite at the beginning of the 1900s, it said that we weren't born in Africa, but that each population had been came from where it was from. So we thought that the sapiens in Africa were developed by Neanderthal in Africa and developed into sapiens. Subsequent DNA analysis proves that this is not so, that we all come from Africa, but that within the various parts of Europe we hybridized with others, other populations, older population, Neanderthal or Denisova, that were already here. One last question. I'd like to ask you something. You spoke about diseases, of things that were positive in the Neanderthal, but which have become more negative or diseases in our day and age. I would like to know that your research is also aimed at this point to manage to correct what currently are diseases linked to DNA. In practice, if we have, I don't know, Alzheimer's, yes, because it's due to DNA, these diseases that we have, because of evolution, an evolution that might be considered as an involution. You mean to erase the debts? Well, they're a disadvantage today with today's society. But 1,000 years ago, they went to disadvantage. So a way to correct it might be to go back to how we lived 1,000 years ago. I can't think of any others because the diseases I mentioned are not so-called Mendelian diseases, that is to say, given by a single gene, a single mutation. So for those diseases in the future, we can envisage a possibility of correcting them, reverting the mutation. But the diseases that we were talking about, that is to say, cardiovascular disease, Parkinson, Alzheimer's, are complex diseases. That is to say, they're given by very many genes, and many of the genes have not yet been fully understood. So it's really a fight against windmills nowadays. I'm sorry, we can't hear you. She said, is there the possibility of understanding with something that we saw in the past to go back? Yes, there might be, but in a very, very, very distant future, because it means that we were able to identify all the mutations that cause it, inverting all of these with the ethical problems that this entails. And this is another field. Right, thank you very much. I would really have to close this conference here. I would like to ask you one thing. I'd like to ask Serena and Aneli one thing, if this experience of being here as a popularizer is an episode, or, as we all hope, it's something that you wish to continue. Who knows? I don't know. I like it when I do it, but I get very worried before I do it, so I don't know.
Grazie, Serena Aneli.